That's all right. I've got to be out of here by 2 normally because I have to go down to the chamber.
With it, also, everybody got
Board
that.
meeting with a company that's
So we're covered. We're covered all the way.
also going to talk
You're
to
sabotaging.
senior chamber people about
You know,
some of these issues.
I have nothing to do with that.
Well, Tom Guy is interested, partly because I do stuff with his son.
This is the update. This
I got a list. I
as
got
of this morning.
That's the morning?
Couple
Oh,
of
okay.
other people.
Oh, all right. Wow. If all these people are here, who's guarding the store?
Exactly. Who's watching the store? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mike Swetnam. I'm the CEO and chairman here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. We're a public policy research institution devoted to finding and addressing the most critical areas of technology that affect our society. And for those of you who don't know about us, we've been involved in that process for almost 20 years. And for a good part of that time, it's been our honor to have at the Potomac Institute the International Center for Terrorism Studies, headed by Professor Yona Alexander, who has over 40 years of experience and background in all aspects of the academic study of terrorism. In fact, Professor Alexander and his center are responsible for over 100 books over the last 40 years on terrorism. So it's a real privilege to have that academic effort here at the Institute. And as part of that academic endeavor, we hold seminars about once a month, sometimes more often, on all aspects and issues of terrorism. Today is a unique one, if you will. Today we're addressing the issues of terrorism and intelligence and the role of intelligence in the war on terror. And some might even say the role of terrorism in the practice of intelligence. It's an interesting concept that in fact terrorism as an art is more closely related sometimes with the practice of intelligence than intelligence as a tool to counter terrorism. There's a relationship in there somewhere. There are a lot of people who will tell you that the intelligence community in various countries are the terrorists. There are others who will make the point that in fact we're free and kept free by the fact that the pointy end of the spear are the intelligence professionals who are out there in the dark of night making sure that those who would do us harm are found before that happens. And that is absolutely the truth. I know that General Gray and Dr. Kerr will make those points over and over. I wanted to open the session with a few words, a perspective, if you will, on the changing nature of not just terrorism, but the practice of intelligence in the modern age, due almost exclusively, I think, to technology. And I'll start my comments by trying to convince you that this whole technological thing is affecting society more than almost anything else in our lives. If you let me go way back, you talk about the invention of the printing press, it shouldn't be any doubt in anybody's mind that the printing press didn't just spread knowledge and education across the old world, but in fact was the reason for revolutions, the fall of governments, and eventually wars. One technology totally changed the way the society operated. We figured out how to do mass development and manufacturing and created the Industrial Revolution that moved masses of people from the farms to the cities and once again totally changed the way we did business. Then we had aircraft travel, nuclear weapons, communications, all of these vast, big technologies that change the way we operate and the way we live. Today, those technologies are coming faster and faster and faster, and even more important than changing our society, they're changing the way that those who wish to do us harm actually can go do it. We have to be worried about the fact that more and more the bad guys learn how to use these technologies before the good guys do. We had a presentation a couple weeks ago about from a police chief in LA County in California talking about the use of social media tweeting and text messages by the gangs and the drug trade in that part of the world, which would absolutely blow your mind. It was so sophisticated that they tracked police movements. They recruited and changed their way of operation moment to moment through the use of modern technology. Clearly, the ability to use that technology for good or bad is profoundly changing our world today. And how we deal with that is a question that I think lots of us need to be concerned with. It's not just changing the way the terrorists operate, but it absolutely should change the way I think our intelligence community operates. When we talk about the war on terror, if I can bring that thought of technology changing everything home to terrorism, there's lots of discussion, as there has been for decades and decades, well noted and documented by Professor Alexander, about terrorism being a tool often used by the disenfranchised, those without armies, who try to have a strategic impact on the world, turn to terrorism because it's the old Sun Tzu, kill one and frighten many, many, many more, the concept of terrorism. Well, doing that, causing terror in us, is just as much a propaganda campaign, a media campaign, as it is an actual implementation of death, destruction, or maiming us. A terrorist doesn't succeed if he just kills 3 people in a back alley and nobody knows about it. The terrorist has to do that in the public to get the media attention, to give him what he's looking for. So it has an awful lot to do with media and propaganda. Let me tell you a story about the Iraq War, and I know at one point this was probably very classified, but it's all out there on the internet now, and it's actually pretty well documented. It's something called Operation Valhalla, and for those of you who haven't looked it up, I encourage you to go look it up. This is a special forces operation in Iraq about 5 years ago, where the very routine special forces operation, by the way, where they went in to deal with some Iraqi special forces terror units, identified their location. The special forces guys swooped in at night, and gunfire ensued. They killed 17 and captured 16, pulled out, destroyed the weapons dump. Very successful operation. They shut down that Iraqi unit that had been causing trouble, Iraqi Al-Qaeda insurgent unit that had been causing trouble. Within 24 hours of the Special Forces operation concluding, the insurgents in Iraq rolled in, took the 17 bodies that were left laying there, arranged them on prayer mats inside of a mosque, took pictures to make it look like they were shot while they were praying, and proliferated those pictures across the internet and throughout the Middle East, causing a tremendous fervor and backlash against the United States forces that were there at the time. How dare they go shoot these poor Muslims while they're praying? It took us 3 weeks to respond. Of course, 3 weeks in social media, internet time is about 4 decades in normal time, and you can make the point that we never fully countered the hearts and minds propaganda problem caused by the fact that the bad guys were quicker than us in rolling in there, massaging and changing the situation to look like something that it wasn't. Point being that this whole game of terrorism needs to be thought about, not just in the context of finding the bad guys and killing them. We need to also think about it in the context of how do we deal with the social, psychological problems that causes rise to terrorism, and how do we deal with that in a modern age of communication, internet technology, where the speed of information can sometimes be far greater than the speed of our action. And I'll make the point that we have a long way to go in that regard. There's a lot yet to do. There's a lot yet to us even understanding what it means to do that in the modern age. It sounds like I'm jumping topics, but I think to me at least, it's about the same topic. How much damage did Snowden cause? How much damage did Snowden cause because he released sensitive information which really affected our ability to do the job of collecting intelligence? And how much damage did Edward Snowden do because the image of the U.S. government as breaching your privacy, NSA is a bad person that people on Capitol Hill want to hit its budget. How much damage did he do there? Was the damage greater in the effect on our image, our support, our funding, our public support around the world? Was that damage greater than the actual collection damage? I think that's a very important discussion to have and realize that in the world that we're facing, one might actually be more important than the other. I'll put that in the context of something going on in China. China started a campaign about a year and a half ago where they recruited young people, mostly in college students, to address the image of China in social media. And they told these young people that we'll give you have to play they're playing the games on the internet in China. It's kind of a closed internet. Playing games on the internet in China costs. You have to pay each time you play. And for the young people, playing the games is a big deal. Government was giving young people credit to play the games if every time when they're in social media, the young people found a negative mention of the Chinese government, if on their own they had full authority from the state, if you see a negative mention of China out there on the internet, go counter it. Go say something good. And every time a young person did that, he could report it and get credit to play games. It's been reported that currently in the Chinese system, 500,000 young people are participating. 500,000 young people are daily scouring the internet, and when they see negative comments about China, change it, make a comment the other way. They're clearly using the system in ways that we haven't thought about yet. Of course, this isn't a secret. The Dell Computer Corporation opened up the same service, and we'll sell it to you today. You can go to Dell Computer Corporation and say, I'm worried about the image of the Potomac Institute. Will you follow it on the internet? And when you see somebody saying something bad about the Potomac Institute, will you insert these good languages instead? This whole concept of operating in the propaganda world is really important, and one that I would assert to you today is where a lot of the future of not just the intelligence community, but the future of warfare, the future of conflict, and the future resides, and we haven't thought enough about what it means and how we deal with it and how we might deal with it in the future. So with those comments about technology and terrorism and how it's all changing, I don't mean to be the guy trying to scare you or say all the things that are negative, but I do mean to try and imply that as we face these issues going forward, let's think about them in the context of the technology that's empowering us, because clearly some of the first users of that technology are not the good guys. They're the bad guys. The people who have armies have an option for dealing with some of these things that worry them. It's those who don't have an army, who feel unenfranchised, disenfranchised, and not empowered, that turn to the issues, turn to the tactics of terrorism. That same motivation, I think, leads them to use technology in ways that we hadn't conceived of before, and that unfortunately surprise us all too often. With those comments, or probably nowhere near as brief as they should have been, I'm going to turn the microphone over to the real experts, and we'll start with a member of our Board of Regents here at the Potomac Institute, and a person I'm proud to have called a mentor over the years. The Honorable Dr. Don Kerr has been in many jobs in many different types of activities for a couple decades, and has influenced the lives of a lot of people, myself most particularly, over those decades in very, very profound ways. He was one of the youngest directors of the Los Alamos Nuclear Laboratory years and years ago when I was graduating from high school, and my father was a forest ranger in that part of the world. And his leadership of the National Laboratory at that time is still talked about as the last golden era of Los Alamos Laboratory. There was the time that we really had technology leadership. After lots of other stops in between, he was called back to government by the director of the FBI to help them figure out how to be technical. This was a time when the FBI was still doing fingerprints by collecting dust and spreading it across doorknobs and stuff like that. All these things you see about CSI Miami and all that kind of stuff on the TV, that came to the FBI through the good graces of Dr. Kerr, who was hired as a deputy director to set up the FBI's technical center and actually made the Bureau technical. He brought a full suite of capability that today, when you read about the FBI swooping into a crime scene and doing all of these things that allow them to analyze everything from the fiber to minute particles in the air, that was all created by Dr. Kerr or the FBI. And if that second revolutionary career in government was not enough, at the end of that, at a time when many people were criticizing the intelligence community for having lost its technical edge during the 90s, 80s, and 90s, he was hired by the Director of Central Intelligence to come back into the government as the head of science and technology at the CIA to rebuild what was before that a glorious history of technology, and was so successful at that job. Almost everybody, I think, will agree he was totally successful at that job, was rewarded with management of another ailing part of our country needing great technical advancement, the National Reconnaissance Organization, and he turned that around and once again was called back to federal service and served as the Deputy Director of National Intelligence. So it is with great honor that I can introduce to you today one of the most accomplished technical public servants this country has ever seen, and a person I'm very proud to call a friend. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Dr. Don Kerr.
Well, Mike has been very polite in revealing that I have a hard time keeping a job. And what I thought I'd do is share with you some thoughts about those different stops along the way and the way they related to terrorism. I think Yona and I first started working on this before he was pirated away from CSIS many years ago, back in the 80s and even the 70s. So unfortunately, it's been more than just 2 decades. And for the intelligence professionals here, I should probably start by saying what I think of as kind of the first law of intelligence. And if you're comfortable with it, you'll have a happy career. If you're not, you'll probably get in trouble. And that is, there really are no policy failures. There are only intelligence failures. And we've seen that play over and over again over the years. But it's a reminder that in the intelligence community, we're not part of the policy community, we're there supporting it. And occasionally that leads to stress and strain, some of which we're seeing today. Let me turn to the point of bringing everyone together today to talk about some of the changes in the conduct of intelligence. And it's really the fact that the response to violent extremism and transnational crime over the past 2 decades have driven much tighter integration of intelligence and operations than we've seen in the past. As one of my good friends and colleagues put it, Mike Hayden, we're closer to having OSS today than when we had OSS. And what's driven that is in fact a cycle of activities driven by the, if you will, find, fix, and finish mantra that leads to the need to act, exploit, plan, target, act, and that cycle has now become a 24-hour cycle for a lot of our forces. The other thing that's happened is that we've brought new and different types of intelligence resources to the problem. It's no longer the question of the order of battle comparison between opposing military forces. In fact, terrorism, transnational crime, all at the end of the day force you to track people and identify people, understand what they're doing in order to appropriately target and intervene when it's necessary to do so. What that's led to, of course, is an expansion particularly of those techniques to gather information on how operations are supported. How are people recruited? How are they trained? What's the support mechanism for providing them with weapons, access to the places where they would like to do us harm, and to do it in a timely manner? Now, we used to think that the technical part of and the human part of intelligence was in the physical world, keeping track of people as they move, watching them as they do things. And of course, the technology that we use today creates another form of detritus, if you will, in the electronic world, and we have to keep track of that as well. Key to some of the successes in the recent past are the ability to understand terrorist financing networks, the ability to track the movement of funds, understand where they're going. It grew out of capabilities first developed by the Treasury Department, organization called FinCEN, but enhanced considerably by what was done in the intelligence community and in law enforcement subsequent to what Treasury had been able to do. It takes advantage, obviously, of access to networks to understand the financial flows. Similarly, the logistics can be tracked in ways that are appropriate as well. And I think what it's led to for now is a primacy of both human and SIGINT working together to solve the most critical problems. Why do I say working together? There are those who would say, well, if I can have access to all of the communications that I think are relevant, I'll know what they're doing. Well, people lie on the phone too, or they speak in ways that are hard to understand. The counter-narcotics folks learned that years ago. Their Spanish speakers didn't understand the argot of those on the street, and the consequence was you needed direct human interaction as well. Now, Mike, of course, made a great statement about the value of technology, and I would only add one caution to that before we all rush off and invest. I used to talk to people and say that everything I want to know from an intelligence point of view is in 3 buckets. And the first bucket I'll call open source. And I can learn an awful lot there, limited only by arms and legs and the ability to analyze the data, organize it, and make it useful to other people. The second bucket is all of that which I can learn only through human interaction. And whether it's clandestine collection, diplomatic reporting, reports from businessmen returning from interactions they've had, it too is key, particularly when one is trying to understand plans and intentions. And then there's this thing we call technical collection that's of course evidenced in its most expensive form by an entity that I once led called the NRO, and it consumes a lot of money. It includes some of our actually best SIGINT capabilities as well. And one fact people in Washington often miss is only one of those 3 buckets has lobbyists. And it's obvious which one. It's the technical piece, because that's where the money is. It doesn't mean the others are less important. It means that often they get less than the appropriate level of attention in terms of the problems they're capable of solving. The recent disclosure, basically amplified by the media and some other irresponsible commenting, have focused attention once again on issues of privacy, security, and anonymous behavior, without a very clear discussion about the risks and benefits and constraints that attend the various activities that are being discussed. Some years ago, while at the FBI, I had the misfortune to have a program called Carnivore. Some of you may have heard of it at the time. It was an email intercept program. It, in fact, used the very properties of the internet to comply with the court orders under which it was carried out. That being the fact that every packet has an address on it. The court order would say which addresses you could collect against. They were obviously tied to people by name. And so you would go on a big pipe and you'd collect the packets that had the right address on them. I found myself in front of the House Judiciary Committee one morning, and on the one side of the dais were people like Mr. Conyers, who's been part of the debate as recently as yesterday, Mr. Nadler from New York. They viewed this as another invasion of privacy and security of the public by the federal government. And on the other side of the dais was, among many, was a man named Robert Barr, former federal prosecutor in Georgia, whose libertarian view was this was just another overreach of big government. I found myself in a position where the middle had shrunk to near zero. But it was also true that no one had ever explained to them the fact that new packet switch systems had addressing data, that filtering and selection could be done. And oh, by the way, a federal employee who misused that kind of intercept capability would commit a felony. In those days, I think the penalty was 5 years in jail and $250,000 fine. And I know of no one who's been prosecuted for that in recent years. I think the people who do it, whether for intelligence purposes or for law enforcement purposes, are actually well grounded in what Title 18 and Title 50 require when you do this sort of activity. But that hasn't come to the fore in the debate that's gone on as recently as yesterday. There are calls for more constraints and guidelines and oversight of intelligence that are so far not informed by good descriptions of what the current law and regulations are. And I think we're having not a discussion or a debate at the present time. We're having people shout at each other or past each other instead, which I think is a great loss to all of us. Let me go to the real issue of terrorism for a moment. When I came to the FBI, 8 months after that, the 2 embassy bombings took place in Africa. And my people actually were the ones assigned to what were then called crime scenes. They were involved in collecting evidence and remains as well. And I think one of the memories that sticks with me the most was going out at night in Nairobi to the scene of the bombing there at the embassy. And it's the, if you will, the smell of decaying flesh. The fact that you were face to face with where over 200 people had died. And it's something you don't forget. The next incident was the USS Cole. Again, our explosives teams and others, joined by counterparts from CIA, did the exploitation of what was found on the Cole and also the recovery of some of the victims of that attack. And that, to me, was a turning point, because that's when we started to move from treating these as isolated incidents and criminal activities to understanding that there was a network of people with interests quite different than ours that we were up against. And it led to the then DCI taking that message to the White House and elsewhere, and did so well into 2001 when 9/11 took place. It took that event to really force some of the things that we've seen in the last 10 years to happen in terms of integration. It also, the reality of pursuing the fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, forced that integration as well. Some of us take pride in the fact that we were able to do something in Afghanistan 6 weeks after 9/11 because CIA had a plan. We also paid for an army. What we didn't have and didn't have the capability to do was, having displaced the Taliban, to occupy and change the facts on the ground. And of course, that inability is what has led to the extended engagement that's going on even today. And I think an important lesson from that is that you can't ask the intelligence community to take on a responsibility for which it is truly unprepared. It doesn't have the mass, the numbers, the people to occupy, and that became a Department of Defense responsibility. But even that's insufficient. It really needs to become a whole of government responsibility, and we've not yet done that very well, to be honest. The other thing we learned right after 9/11 was the incredible value of our relationships with other governments and other intelligence services. We could not have done the things that were accomplished in the last 10 years without those relationships. And these are not sort of what I'll call the privileged old relationships, the so-called Five Eyes. These involve tens of countries worldwide that have quietly and effectively helped in dealing with violent extremism that both threatens them and also continues to threaten the United States. You might ask, well, what's the state of that? And I think up till a month or so ago, one could have argued it was actually very good. What you've seen, however, is that when other governments are forced by their media as a consequence of disclosures here to speak directly about what they do and what they know, they're as awkward as we are in dealing with that. No surprise. And I think the relationships and our dependence on them are severely threatened by the revelations, not just of Mr. Snowden, some by our overheated elected officials who take great pride in an accomplishment, and in doing so disclose capabilities and approaches that we should not have disclosed. And so at the end of the day, it's not just leaks and other sorts of unauthorized disclosure. It's the people who made a decision on their own that they know better and disclose, and in fact cause a great reduction in capability. Another and very important thing, I think, is public support for intelligence activities. This awkward coexistence of secret intelligence activities in a democracy such as ours. It's always been an awkward relationship. It's always actually been easier to deal with when the intelligence side is in secret and not highly visible. As soon as it becomes highly visible, we have not only those who seriously want to understand what's being done and what the implications of it are, we have the others who want to make an issue of it because perhaps they don't support it either personally or politically, and they force a debate in public that's not helpful actually to either side. It's clear to me that at the present time we've had this very awkward situation where the director of NSA the head of an agency mainly involved with collection and analysis of signals is actually forced to become a surrogate for the policy community that's absent from the debate. That's not appropriate. It's not appropriate for a serving military officer or the director of an intelligence agency, and he's both. So I'm worried that the inability of the senior elected leadership to address this kind of issue in an effective way is going to hurt all of us over time. And of course it will lead to more votes like the one that was narrowly avoided last night, where people, it's a free shot for them. It doesn't take any great depth of thought and research to offer that amendment, but you sure would undo an awful lot of capability on which we depend for our safety and security, both now and in the future. I think it's appropriate to stand and look at my neighbor, Mike Rogers, who played such an important role. He's a good neighbor, in addition to being the chairman of the Intel Committee. We walk our dogs together about 2 nights a week, and we don't talk business for any of you who care. Another important thing, and General Gray may want to weigh in on this as well. We're just about 30 years from the morning in Lebanon when the yellow truck came on base, detonated, and killed, 240 Marines and sailors. And if you really want to look at a fundamental moment where we started to engage this problem, that was it. But it's taken a series of other events where there's been loss of life, loss of property, and loss of stature for our country to get people seriously thinking about what we need in terms of tools and appropriate techniques for the future. One of the things we need to do is sort out what privacy means. There are people who argue that security and privacy are antithetical to one another. I don't happen to believe that, but it really depends on your definitions before you can discuss it. And certainly, just being anonymous is not an element of privacy. I think we have to separate that, and the reason I think so is that's the battle to be anonymous is one we can't win, and we give it up every day. Lots of our fellow citizens give it up to get a 5% discount at whatever set of stores, and when you log into Google and put your name in, you've given up a lot of privacy as well. We have another part of this problem, which is a generational problem. An awful lot of people are at least 2 generations younger than I am. Their view of privacy and anonymity is very different perhaps than mine. As a former intelligence professional, I'm not comfortable using things like Facebook and Twitter and the like. On the other hand, the people we'll be recruiting in the future will, in many cases, come with that as part of the baggage they bring to the job. They have different views about what they want to share with their friends and the broader public than curmudgeons like me do. And so we have to figure out how to adapt to the expectations of our population without sacrificing on the security side and safety side as much as might otherwise be the case. Absent definitions, absent clarity, you can't talk about legislation or regulation that makes any sense at all. They become blunt instruments with effects that are very hard to predict. So I think we, as citizens, need to demand more from those who make statements about this and would legislate or regulate than simply saying, we don't like the fact that the NSA uses metadata. My goodness, what a horrible invasion. Well, it was not so many years ago, the courts found that metadata is not something where you have the expectation of privacy. Of course, the metadata they were talking about was the address on the envelope that brings your mail to you and not to your neighbor. But by extension, they've argued that the metadata associated with packet switch networks, not the content, the metadata, is also not under an expectation of privacy as well. There are people who dispute that view, but in fact the present law and its interpretation allow for the kind of collection that the NSA has been doing and law enforcement. Now you ask, okay, why is it so valuable? And the answer is that analytics applied to large data sets have advanced considerably, and in fact allow one to discern patterns of behavior in these large data sets where there are patterns that actually are indicative of people doing things that perhaps you would prefer them not to do. And there's no content that's been exposed at that point. If there's a reason to go to content, they still have to go back to a court and in fact bring a warrant or other request to gain access to the content. So we here have again people talking past one another. How it will work out, I don't know. One of the things I would expect is that the companies, because they're public companies, will find that they'll want a different relationship with the government than they've had. And they will probably want them either to retain their records until they get an appropriate order from a court or through other government entities before they release it, or they'll want the government to store it and be responsible for its care. The reason is that they otherwise will be exposed to potential litigation, true or not, that will hound them forever in the marketplace, if not in damage to their reputation. So it's instructive to go back to 2008 when we were working on the reauthorization of the FISA law. And you may recall there was a great debate about it at the time. There were actually 5 provisions, 4 of them which had to do with what could be collected under what circumstances, actually went through with little or no concern once the members had been appropriately informed, and along with their staffs. The 5th one was the one that hung it up for quite a while, and that had to do with providing immunity to the telecommunications companies that had supported the intelligence community so well right after 9/11. They came to us and said, what can we do to be of help? The setting was post 9/11 for the certainly several weeks to months was, is there another attack imminent? What information could we get that would allow people to work on that question of preparing for or discovering what the next attack might be? And so, in fact, led by a then senior executive from IBM, 63 companies came together in northern New Jersey, represented by their CEOs or chief operating officers or someone else who could commit them. They were not looking for letter contracts. They were simply asking how the capabilities and information they had could help the government in this time of need. The provision in the FISA reauthorization was to give those companies immunity from those who retrospectively thought it was appropriate to litigate because they had turned over things like telephone transaction records. And so the debate that took the longest was to provide that immunity and dealing with that part of the legal profession that thought a market was being taken away from them, to be crude about it. So it's instructive, but something we need to be wary of as we approach if you will, the next round of this debate, because FISA reauthorization will be coming up again. It's done 5 years at a time. It will be inflamed by what's happened post-Snowden and all of the other publicity. And I just, if you will, implore you to keep a cool head, ask people to justify the statements they make, and at least let's have an informed debate rather than the one we've been having most recently. I think I'll stop at this point because I had promised Yonah if there were questions I'd be here to do that, and that of course allows me to give way to my good friend and colleague who used to watch me, or is Yonah going to do that?
No, Jonas next.
Oh, okay.
Well, if I may, first of all, thank you very much, Dr. Kerr.
Jonas is gonna now get me mad.
General, whatever you say.
One thing about you.
I'm a good soldier.
One thing about you, you're the world's greatest expert at not listening.
Well, General,
With that introduction, Yonah, say thank you.
if
I
I
gotta go
may,
get-
I
I'm
would
gonna
like
go get
I
it.
would like you to
Go ahead.
go up there.
Go ahead.
I will hold the book, General Gray's book, Insiders Insights, and I am very humbled to be associated with the general writer of the Potomac Institute. You have book flyers, so you can order the book, and I told my students to read the book, but we're not going to give them a test on that, so they were very pleased. At any rate, I think it would be very useful for the general to provide his own insights, and then, if I may, General, you always have the last word, but I have some academic homekeeping obligations after your talk.
Okay. All right.
So, but we
You
would
want me to
like
go
to
now?
invite you over there, yes.
Thank you for nothing.
Just tell them what volume 2 is going to happen.
Oh, yeah. You have to understand that the former Marine major who wrote that book, for 5 years I wouldn't let him do it. He's become a close friend of mine over time, and I hate that kind of stuff for all the right reasons. And but the Potomac Institute, which published it, and the author who wrote it, they conned me into letting them do it because they agreed that all of the proceeds would go to the Marine Semper Fi Fund, which some of you may know is a great fund, one of the highest rated funds in the country by Charity Navigator and others, and we've raised over $80 million, and we've given $70 million out to military servicemen and women and their families who have been seriously wounded, including over 600 Army families. And so when he did, and I chair the fund, and so what could I say? And so you're stuck with that. Let me just get on with the topic at hand here. And you saw me writing on these notes because Mike Schwetman had to leave. He's got another important meeting, and so I have to do the closing remarks too. And so I had to make a few notes, and I'll make a few notes of what Yonah has to say as well. But let me say up front that I'm very pro the intelligence community, and anybody who doesn't like that, that's fine. But I'm very pro the intelligence community. I've got many years of close association with the community, and have even today. We served, for example, on the Gold Team as an advisor to the National Reconnaissance Office when his lordship was there. And for 22 years, I've been an advisor a senior advisor on the National Security Agency board as well. And so I've been fortunate enough in my life to get to know a great many of the young men and women who serve in all of the intelligence community, be it the National Spatial Community, be it the Defense Intelligence Agency, be it CIA, NRO, the National Security Agency, etc. And in my experience, we're just awfully thankful that we have these people. They're loyal, they're dedicated, they work long hours, and many times, in fact, most of the time, in deep anonymous mode, if you will, because of the nature of what they do. And as I've said many times in the last 60 years or so, if we didn't have the Central Intelligence Agency, we'd have to invent one like it. And so that doesn't mean that everything that they've ever done has been perfect or right or correct or anything like that. But it's a damn poor carpenter that doesn't hit his thumb with a hammer once in a while. He's not driving any nails. And when you look at in context of what they do and what they are up against and how they have to do it, and the marvelous human element to the agency as well, to all the agencies, as well as the technology improvements and progress we've made, it's really been awesome through the years. And to second what my distinguished predecessor said, it's not the intelligence people who have to provide and make the decisions. It's the policymakers, and in the case of my profession, the military, it's the commanders. And we seem to lose sight of that. And the first thing that happens when something goes wrong, we have a lot of finger pointing, and the people on the other side of the river decide to have a commission to look into it. We ought to bar all commissions for about a decade or so and get on with doing what we have to do, because they not only cost a lot of money and waste a lot of valuable time on a lot of important people who are busy as it is, but they end up really being of limited to no value. Others will disagree on this. We have to have the 9/11 Commission, this commission, that commission, but I personally never got any value out of any of that. They never helped me one iota with respect to solving some of the challenges that this nation faces. And so that's my view on all of that. What we ought to do is focus on, if we want to have a commission for a commission's sake, then focus on how do we get better? How do we do what we have to do? How do we handle some of these challenges that Don has mentioned and others have mentioned through the years whenever we have this topic? For example, it was mentioned the Beirut bombing. Actually, in the Beirut bombing, we had 249 Marines, 12 sailors, and 3 soldiers got killed in that terrorist attack. They were all assigned to my division. And so I know this very, very well, and I lived through that, and I will never forget that, nor will I forget the people who were involved. The Hezbollah, Iran, and Damascus in Syria. The efforts came that way. It was the money, everything came from Iran through Damascus to the Beirut front, and then to the Hezbollah. And it wasn't just the U.S. forces, and it wasn't, by the way, a car bomb or a little truck bomb. It was a 19-ton truck. There were 20 construction trucks operating on the airfield at the time, because Lebanon is a country of commerce, as you know, and they had to build up the airfield so they could do business. And so there were 20 of these trucks on the airport, and they had one was loaded with it was a 19-ton truck loaded with the latest Soviet fuel-enhanced explosives. It was the largest non-nuclear explosion ever known. And so don't think that this was just a minor league operation. This was a major league operation in every aspect. And I would remind you that within 2 minutes, They blew up the U.S. And it wasn't a barracks; it was a headquarters. That's where a lot of people were there. It was a headquarters and a sick bay and all the other kind of things that go with a big headquarters, not a barracks. Some people sleep there because they worked in that building. But within 2 minutes, they blew up the French headquarters and killed 89 French men. I went to that funeral as well, and that ceremony. And they also, within that time frame, blew up the Israeli headquarters and killed 59. So if you think that this was a ragtag or whatever you want to call it, operation or a fly-by-night, you're just wrong. This was a very carefully thought through, long-term planned operation by people who really knew what they were doing. And so that's the kind of enemy, if you will, or that's the kind of people that we were up against in 1983. And as had been mentioned, it wasn't until around 2001 that we get around to seeing that this is serious kind of stuff. We should have had the war on terrorist activities in 1983. I mean, what more do you need? And besides that, in April, before the October 23rd bombing, in April they blew up the British embassy and the U.S. embassy. Now, what do you need to kick the free world into action? Are you going to let that happen again? That's a good thing to think about. It's been mentioned now that terrorism is a tool. I believe it's a tactic, and it's a tactic that's been used by armies and nations and people since the dawn of history. And you use terrorist kind of tactics because you don't have the bigger capabilities to do other kinds of things, and you can cause a lot of trouble with those kind of tactics. Mao Zedong made a career out of terrorism type tactics. It was one of the phases of his 4 phases of how to fight. We were up against a lot of terrorism in the Vietnam War that nobody ever talks about. The media has never really mentioned that. In 1966 alone, and as I've said this before in these kind of forums, there were over 1,000 South Vietnamese village chiefs assassinated by the Viet Cong terrorist organization and the North Vietnamese, because they were trying to support the fledgling South Vietnam government. If you were with me on the 12th of October in 1966, south of Da Nang, you would have seen a 9-year-old Vietnamese girl come running across the rice paddies to get help from the Marines. Her father had been assassinated the night before. He'd been a village chief, and her arms had been severed at the elbows by the Viet Cong. You didn't read about that in the paper. You didn't read, or anything like that. Yeah, you read about My Lai and the so-called, all those kind of things that we allegedly did, but you don't read anything about that kind of activity. So the point I want to make simply is that all of the people who have been anti one thing or another, or operating or fighting against what we believe in as a country and as a free world as we know it, or a lot of them at least, have resorted to these tactics, and and everybody knows it. And the one kind of government, the one type of people that you can use these tactics against most effectively, or to say it another way, the kind of country that is the hardest to defend against terrorist type activities are parliamentary type, democratic type countries, parliamentary type countries, countries that grow up with the idea of freedom and the like, and much to say, freedom of the press, freedom of this, freedom of that, and so on and so forth like that. It's almost impossible to take the kind of action you have to take. In World War II, when the Germans occupied many of those countries and the like, their tactics included, if you had partisan type activity in a village, and you detonated what's known as an IED today, an explosive device and the like, or if you threw some bombs at some German soldiers, the next morning 300 or 400 of the civilians would be simply eliminated, would be killed. That discourages that kind of activity. Now, we, in our country and in our way of life and in other countries like us and all, you couldn't do that. That's not what we're all about. And we never have done that. And we, in fact, we lean over backwards to protect people and not have that kind of thing happen. So these are some of the disadvantages of being in a country and in a free world that we try to represent. And yet they're disadvantages we're going to live with, because that's the way we are. There's no sense in reverting to being a barbarian just because other people are using barbaric type activities against you. And so that's what we have to do. We're losing the information war. That's what this is all about, and terrorist-type activities and tactics are tied in, as Mike Schwetman said earlier, tied in completely with the whole information war idea. And the speed and all with which they react to, which was alluded to earlier, is real. I remember when I thought that President Bush the Younger gave a pretty great speech after the terrorist attack and the like, and what it meant to the free world and what it was going to take to counter it. Any resemblance at all between President Bush's speech and the Urdu translations throughout Central Asia and Pakistan, etc., are purely coincidental. They are that quick. They just it blows your mind. And people say, well, but they don't have all the equipment we have. They don't have all the sophistication. They don't have this. They don't have that. Let me tell you, we learned the hard way in Vietnam that don't underestimate the enemy, ever. And as Sun Tzu and others have said for years and all through time, I mean, it's just the Viet Cong, for example, who had nothing except support from the North Vietnamese and the like. They captured some of our PRD-1 radios, and what a PRD-1 was, a direction-finding radio, and it was not good against FM and VHF type signals and all, but it was very good against high-frequency signals and the like. The problem was that it was good against the ground wave, but it also intercepted against the sky wave, and differentiating that, and figuring out whether it was a sky wave or the ground wave was a bit of a problem. U.S. forces generally, until around 1967 and 68, were not very good with this piece of equipment. The Viet Cong were superb with this piece of equipment, and had no problem at all getting good DF fixes and locations on our high-frequency transmissions and the like. And some of you are old enough to remember Vietnam, remember this time, but we had a terrible time. U.S. People in particular are not very good at wanting to be secure and operational security and the like. And we came out, the National Security Agency came out with a program in 1967 where we were going to change our radio frequencies every month and change our call signs every 2 weeks. Well, this was almost, they wanted to do this for years, and it was too much for the American military guy to cope with. We didn't do that. Our military, as you recall, we built a box to put in front of the radio, and that took care of that. It was a encryption box and all that kind of thing. And of course, it used a lot of power and all that kind of thing, with the batteries and everything like that. But that was our answer to it. We had a box to do that. We couldn't do the other. And when we finally decided to try to do it anyway in 1967, you'd see the radio operators with all the damn call signs on their sleeve. They couldn't memorize all that stuff. It was too hard for them, for these brilliant Americans and these brilliant American technology guys. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong changed their call signs and their frequencies every month. And they weren't written on their sleeves. It was all memorized. And if you want to get that book, and you can read in that book, we had 3,800 people 3,800 people in Southeast Asia were trying to intercept Viet Cong voice communications, and they couldn't do it. Couldn't do it. And then one of the reasons why we keep saying you should have all-source fusion, collaboration, everybody should work together, whether it's photography, intelligence, or SIGINT, or human, or anything else like that. One night in August of 1967, the combat intelligence officer and the CO of the SIGINT unit and the counterintelligence officer of the range headquarters in Da Nang had their annual or their normal 10 o'clock meeting, and they talk about what happened during the day. And the counterintelligence officer said, we captured a Viet Cong south of Da Nang, about 20 miles south of Da Nang, and he had receipts on him for PRC-25 batteries. The PRC-25 was the U.S. voice radio in Vietnam. And they were frequently selling these batteries on the black market. So we said, aha, by gosh, they're using that radio. They must be using voice communications. And so the next day, the Marines went out to one of the hills, Hill 55, south of Da Nang, tweaked up all their intercept equipment, really cleaned it up, and in earnest searched the spectrum for voice communications. And it was noticed that the search operator stopped at 54 megacycles because in the U.S. way of thinking, you didn't go beyond that because of TV and radio relay and interference. And so somebody said to the operator, why don't you run that thing all the way up? The radio goes to 75 megacycles or megahertz. And they did. And at 70 megahertz, they found the Viet Cong chatting away a mile a minute. And what they were chatting away in was a code. And it was very difficult to understand. It was part of the Central Annam dialect, which was different than the South Vietnamese dialect. So it was really, really, really hard. And it sounded like a bunch of gibberish about it sounded like you were going to the Safeway store, a bunch of vegetables and meet me, and all that kind of stuff. And it took 3 or 4 weeks to unravel this. And finally, they went back through the all-source idea, if you will, and did a retrospective analysis of what enemy activity was happening that day. And they began to marry it up, and they found that meet me meant come up on the antenna and come up on the radio, and salt, pepper was 1100, 1100. So they unraveled this whole voice code. Now, the amazing thing about this, there was no code books. This voice code had been totally memorized by Viet Cong operators. So, again, I just want to make the point, as Sun Tzu said many times, Sun Bin and all the other Chinese military philosophers, don't ever underestimate the enemy. It was mentioned, too, about acting quicker than the other guy, the OODA loop, the observation orientation, and the OODA loop concept that was founded by Colonel John Boyd, and it's the heart and soul of the Marine Corps maneuver warfighting thought process and all of that. And I can't emphasize that more. We've got to be able to make our decisions quicker than the other guy. And all of this legislation and all of this talk and all of these things that are going on now between the Congress and the do-gooders and all that kind of thing. Whatever you do, don't let the Congress or anybody else create regulations or laws that are going to prevent us from being quicker than the other guy. And in this world that Snowden, who some people allude to as Paul Revere, I allude to him as something else, but in this world of cyber that you're living in and all, you don't have 8 months or 8 days to do a thorough plan and get this approval and that approval. You've got about 8 seconds to do something or lose. And so, again, we have to be very, very careful. If you read a lot about the Far East philosophy, and as Yona has alluded to, Sun Tzu, if you prefer, or his ancestor Sun Bin, who also was quite a military guy, but they believe in rhetoric and action. That it's not just intelligence, or it's not just this, or it's rhetoric and action. And that's clearly what the terrorists are up to as well. And that's why I said their information warfare, their rhetoric, their talk, their discussions, everything they do is tied into what they do. And we make far too much out of that. We allowed not just the media, but others as well. We made bin Laden a hero, an international hero, by all the talk about it and everything that happened and blah, blah, blah. We should learn to be like the British a little bit and sort of ignore some of that stuff and kind of, be a little bit quieter about all that. And we literally turned this guy into a hero. We've got to learn to handle this thing better. And I don't know how you do that. The Fifth Estate, that they, as the media has christened themselves, they believe that the American people need to know everything that's going on, and so they report everything that's going on. And yet, I have a great deal of faith in the American people. American people pretty much know what they need to know, what they don't need to know, and if you can get the facts in front of the American people, you'll get the right decisions. The question is, are we giving them really the facts as we really know it and think about it, or are we going for sensationalism and this and that, and who gets the first report in, and all that kind of thing? And a lot of us have first-hand experience, like Mr. Duncan, sitting there about this kind of thing and what the media can do. I have too. I remember in 1967, there was a great deal of fussing in America about the McNamara Wall and all that kind of thing. It was a very poor strategic idea. It was dumb. And the military didn't like it, except for General Westmore and a few people like that. But the military people who were doing it were very much against it. And the Marine Corps position was against it as well. And I was the commander of the northernmost outpost by the DMZ at GLN, and it was right in the middle of building this kind of complex. And I remember a guy named Buckley came up, not the big conservative guy, but his brother. He was with the LA Times, and he came up and he interviewed me and this and that, and I said, no, we don't think this is a very good idea. And he promptly reported that Major Gray, the Commander Joe Lynn, thinks it's a great idea. And of course, this reverberated in the chain of command, and fortunately, General Kulak the Elder, who was commanding the Marines in Hawaii and the Pacific at the time, said no. He said he knew Gray, and that Gray knew better than that, and they kind of stopped it. But that's the kind of thing that happens once in a while. So we all have experience with the media sometimes, or we should have, and directly or indirectly and the like. We got to understand that a lot of this is about the hearts and minds of people. Terrorists will not survive very long anywhere in the world if they don't have friendly people around to help them, to collaborate with them, to feed them, etc., 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 etc. And that's where the hearts and minds of the people come in. And we don't understand this in the West and the free world. But most of the people around the world want security over freedom. Security over freedom. This was true in Vietnam. This is true everywhere I've ever been. In other words, you show me that you're going to protect me so that I can farm or do whatever I want to do, I'm going to be with you. And that's the secret. And that's what the Taliban and all the rest of these people, they do. Through terror and other kinds of means, they demonstrate that they can protect the people better than the government can, and that was what led to much of the success with the Viet Cong in South Vietnam for a long period of time. And in those areas where they couldn't do that and didn't do that, and where the military and others took the right kind of action, they weren't successful. And so this security thing is very important. And the hearts and minds of people are very important. We found this out in Helmand province, even today in Afghanistan, where most of the people are pro what we're trying to do because we're taking care of them. We're protecting them. There's also an economic part here that's kind of against the Western way or the U.S. way of doing things. But these people in many parts of the world where we're trying to operate, they've been in economics or business, if you will, for thousands and thousands and more thousands of years. They know more about bartering and trading and cutting deals and doing this and doing that than you've ever read about. And so to get the idea that somebody could conduct business in Anwar province in Iraq or conduct business in Afghanistan without having a way of controlling the population or the people or the enemy, the Taliban or anybody else, is kind of naive. And of course it's done through money. Now the American steps back when they think, we couldn't do those kinds of things. And I'm not being an advocate or a pro or con one way. I'm simply saying that, again, in these parts of the world, things are different. And people live by a different kind of creed. And we should keep this in mind. We think that, the corruption and all that kind of thing, is bad. And it is bad. And you shouldn't, be a proponent of corruption. But it's a way of life in a lot of these countries. That's why in East Asia and South Asia, a lot of places, that's why they all have their kids grow up to be either lawyers or doctors and things like that, because that's where it's easier to do those kind of things. And so these are just the hard, cold facts of life, and we have to understand this. I think I'll probably shut up now. That's enough, isn't it? I've gotten in enough trouble.
Well, you can speak
Okay.
as long as you want.
Don's going to answer all the questions
If I
anyway.
may, in the interest of time, General,
Yeah.
we have a few questions from the
Sure.
audience, and as moderator, if I may take advantage of my role and first ask you a question, then Don. General, you spoke about the long-term strategic thinking of the terrorists. It's not one-shot deal or plan, and obviously, tragically, and also Don mentioned this, we spoke about the tragedy in Beirut, not only against the Americans, as you indicated, French, the Israelis, and all that. Now, this week, a bit of history was made when the European community, they labeled the Hezbollah, the military wing of the Hezbollah, as a terrorist organization. So I'd like to ask you a question about this, because we just marked this month the 90th anniversary of the Hezbollah attack on the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And Iran obviously was involved in this activity as well. And then last year, we had the Hezbollah involved in an attack in Bulgaria against Israeli tourists. And there was a plot also in Cyprus. We're talking about Europe. How long does it take the Europeans, and they were victimized in Beirut as well, and what do you think the problem is? Is there a way to deal with that and to reach a point where we have a common ground, that all of us are on the same page vis-a-vis who are our adversaries, who are the terrorists, and what can we do about it?
Yeah. Well, I think what you have to do, of course, is have a more holistic or total understanding of what Hezbollah is all about and what they're trying to do. They're a very, very dangerous group. They're worldwide now. They're not in Lebanon alone and all that kind of thing. They are, of course, as you all know, they're of the Shia side of the house. And they've long been linked with Iran because of that, and linked with Syria, although that's the Alawite kind of thing because of the neutrality there. So that's who they are. They're well funded. They are operating intensely in Africa today. They're operating in Singapore, in Asia. They've been in 13 or 14 different countries around the world doing things, committing terrorist acts in the last year and a half or 2 years alone. Bulgaria is one, for example, and so they're very active in Venezuela today and in places like that. So this is a very formidable opponent. And they were totally responsible for the kidnapping of Colonel Higgins years ago, and instead of negotiating and letting him be released at the right time, like it should have been, they brutally murdered him and threw him out on the side of the road in Lebanon. And of course, Higgins was very close to me, and so I don't like the Hezbollah, and I never did since 1983, and I don't today. And I like the Syrian people, but I don't like the Syrian government. And I don't know whether these rebels can do much better, anything like that. I worry there. I worry about who's going to take over. I worry about the Muslim Brotherhood movement and the actions and the control that they have there, and all these kind of things. So it's not a very good outlook. But I remember in the are we being broadcast or anything like that? Is this going out? Well, I can tell you. I remember in the first Gulf War, and they had in the plan they had the Syrians alongside of the Marines, and we were on the coast, and then the Syrians and the Egyptians, and then the 18th Airborne Corps from the Army, and then the French. And that was the lineup, right to left or sea ashore, however you want to look at that. And so I kind of made the subtle suggestion, you better change that, because I said, I don't like the Syrians, therefore the Marines don't like the Syrians. And I said, if you put them alongside us, we'll take them out on the way in. And so they put the Egyptians alongside. It was all right. It worked out. But this is a bad group. And it's an international group, and we should. I have nothing against the European Union, but the idea that only the military part of Hezbollah is bad and the civilian part are not, that's crazy. That may be the right thing to do politically right now, because they are in fact controlling the government of Lebanon and all that kind of thing, and so you can rationalize that if you'd like.
I think you have to add another point to what General Gray just said. Hezbollah is in fact a worldwide enterprise. It hasn't produced incidents here in the United States, but it even raises money here. In Latin America, Hezbollah is very, very active in the so-called tri-border region. They've been heavily involved in narcotics trafficking, including the air transport from South America into Africa and on to Europe. And part of the problem is that the whole story doesn't get told, for example, to the Europeans, that their drug problem is in part caused by Hezbollah.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is that we tend to focus on the incidents of the sort that General Gray mentioned, and we try to clean up after the incident rather than trying to clean out the enterprise that we're dealing with. And until we deal with that reality, the incidents will continue.
They also get a lot of money from charities. They have 3 or 4 big charities that they operate in this country and elsewhere that provide money to their coffers as well.
I think we better invite some of our distinguished audience to ask questions or to make comments, because the clock is ticking. Please identify yourself. You have a mic?
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, University of Wisconsin, foreign with the Foreign Service. Dr. Kerr, you started out by saying there are no policy failures, only intelligence failures. I wonder if you can expand on the remark concerning the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, both concerning the weapons of mass destruction, and second concerning our thoughts on what we're going to do after we invaded and overthrew the government.
Does this need to be turned on? The point of my comment really was as an intelligence professional, how do you deal with the world where you find yourself? And I'm not sure that I could argue that it applies to all instances one might have to confront. I would point out to you, however, that one of the things that the issue of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq brought to the fore, but it's gotten less attention perhaps than it should have, is the problem of what I'll call aging information. You'll recall that the IAEA had access to the facilities in Iraq, I guess, just past the mid-90s. And that was perhaps the last on-the-ground information that was available at that time. But that was, 8 years prior to the invasion that you made reference to. You had other things going on as well. So you had past information aging that said they were committed to a program and pursuing it. You had behavior of the Iraqis themselves who were actually propagandizing each other about the capabilities they had. And you had, of course, a small amount of information that was not necessarily all pointing at the same thing. And I think what you have is a problem where the intelligence community was still in the mode of saying they were committed to a program. We haven't seen evidence that they've lost that commitment. We know that they had access to material wherever it might have been. And so what you really have to ask is, was an appropriate measure of the confidence in the information then available, accessible to those who would make the decision? And it obviously today, retrospectively, you can reach a conclusion, but I think you have to put yourself in the situation of people who were making the decision in 2003 and what they thought was known at that time. And that, for me, is kind of the way I think about that particular problem. I don't. Reconstructing the government afterwards?
I mean, it seemed that the U.S. government was under the assumption that putting a new government in place was going to be a fairly easy job.
That wasn't my job, so I have no comment.
Well, I think from the strategic standpoint, if you're talking about the war going into Iraq, there was one glaring mistake in my judgment. There was no strategic reserve. There was absolutely none provided for, and had they followed up the earlier tactical victories and all that kind of thing with a fresh group of people that could have come in there from the sea, turned on the power, turned on the water, provided food, got with this business of hearts and minds of people, etc., 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 and taken advantage of that kind of thing, you would have had a different kind of ending to all of this. And also, we are not, in my opinion, yet very good at the whole interagency process, and that really should have been more of a State Department kind of an operation than a military part, and I won't get into why or this or that or anything else about that and how that all happened, but we didn't have the right kind of teamwork going on, in my opinion, that could have facilitated that whole part. And obviously, even long before they went in, a great deal of thought should have been given to the Kurdish problem. And I remember when I was still a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, And I used to bring up the Kurdish problem every once in a while, and everybody said, "Oh no, don't bring that up." And, I mean, it's a fact of life. You got three main groups in this area of Iraq that all want to have something to say about how they live and how they get along, and of course the Kurdistan is interesting from the old Kurdistan from the standpoint of geography and all that, and being part of Iran and the rest of it, and the resources they have. So I just think, and then the other part of this is that you got Sunnis and you got Shiites in there, and they don't get along, never have, never will, I guess. They sure, even the Hezbollah will not support some of the Sunni type activities and terrorism and like for the same reason. So we didn't, and we knew that. We knew that from the first Gulf War, that if we didn't get in there and stop the Republican Guards from getting back into Basra and places like that intact at the end of the first Gulf War, hell would pay there and with the Shia community, and it did. So, want a new idea? Read an old book.
The final point that I'd make in answer to your question is that you could argue, if you want it consistent with my comment, that Iraq, to some degree, represented a policy failure precipitated by an intelligence failure or problem.
What was the intelligence failure?
The WMD argument.
Well, I mean, are chemical weapons considered WMD?
Yes.
Was there any doubt that there were chemical weapons in there in the first Gulf War, that they were trying to use them? Tactically, they made a mistake, though. They separated the weapons from the people for all the obvious reasons of security and mistrust within their own government. So they tried to use them, but couldn't do it, couldn't get at it. And that was well documented through SIGINT and other operations as well. Some people, I was always of the school of thought that during that period that you mentioned, the 8 years, the delay, that the chemical weapons were moved to Syria, up in the tunnels of Syria. That was what my very poor intelligence resources were telling me.
Well, obviously that's one of the problems. In connection with that, may I ask both of you that while we focus on Syria, for example, the question is what's happening in Iran. We have a new government, Rouhani. By the way, according to various reports, he was involved in the planning of the attack in Buenos Aires. At any rate, what's your assessment in terms of where Iran is in terms of their nuclear campaign or program, and is there anything that the international community can do about it? What's your opinion about it?
I have not been privy to current reporting for a couple of years now, so I will be discreet as a consequence. But I think it was clear some years ago that there were three legs to the Iranian program. One was the development of delivery capabilities, largely their missile systems. The second was the access to fissile material, which was, of course, the reason for some of their enrichment capabilities. And the third was, did they have actually a weaponized design? And there was a period where it appeared that one of those legs was trailing and that they slowed some of the other work in order to get on with producing the fissile material that might be needed. There's no question that they have knowledge of what now is an over 60-year-old technology. That's no big deal. And the real issue is the access to fissile material in sufficient quantities and a weaponized device that they could assemble with it. And my guess is that the current estimates take that into account, and will give you a time scale with error bars that's not too different than it was a few years ago.
I can't add anything much more to that. I think that in many parts of the world, including that part of the world, attainment of a nuclear capability is viewed as being a must if you want to be in the big leagues, or if you want to be a world player and all that type of thing. And I remember after the first Gulf War, when everybody was talking about how great everything was and the technology and all of that, and people were drinking their own bathwater. But the official comment in India after the first Gulf War was that just shows you once again you have to have a nuclear capability in your bag of capability and the like. And so I think that's what's driving a lot of that. I think that the best way is continued kind and that type of thing. I feel very strong about it. I think that there are, whether it's China or anybody else like that, there are three things that kind of concern me a great deal. And one is this nuclear WMD type threat. Another would be the satellite, anti-satellite type of threat, and a third would be the cyber type of threat. And I think in all three cases, a good negotiating position, trying to get people to understand that no first use is the best way to go for all concerned because of the global situation, globality, if you call it that, and the fact that the whole world is more entwined than ever now because of the internet and other kinds of things like that would be the way to go. Now, whether that could be successful or not, nobody knows. It's sort of like the other thing about, without getting into the religious business and the political side and all that kind of thing, but you've got a group of fundamentalist people talking about jihad, and it's unfortunate, maybe that's also a word in the Quran or something like that, but the point I want to make is you've got people saying that they're going to do you bodily harm, and they've been saying that, and Bin Laden said it, and these fundamentalist people are saying it, and other people are saying it, just like Hitler said it in Mein Kampf, and all that kind of thing. And so it's fine to ignore all that, but there ought to be a portion of the government getting ready to understand that maybe they mean what they're saying, and take steps to try to prevent it.
I think I would add another point that General Gray forgot. He mentioned 3 points. I would say the elephant in the room is in fact economic competition and codependence, and that our future with China will depend on our understanding that and finding ways that we're going to operate with them and in competition with them. And the point being, our economy has to be strong for us to have any sensible influence anywhere in the world. I think some of what we're seeing today is a consequence of the recession the last few years, the fact that we seem unable to make any economic decisions right now, and there are those who are taking advantage of that, and we need to worry about it.
Yeah, and China's a good example too. They had a big civil war and at the same time we did, and they had more people killed there in the Taiping Rebellion than we had in the Civil War. I mean, so they got a little bit of history behind them as well, and I think and it's, I don't think it's automatic that they're going to be the next great power either. I would still I would never sell the Japanese short because of their knowledge of technology. As I said before, it's interesting that those skyscrapers in Shanghai that everybody talks about were designed by the Japanese. And India's had 4 revolutions now going on, sort of half simultaneously, if you will, if that's a clause or a phrase. But they're coming out of the woods now. And what happened in southern India some years ago is now happening in northern India with respect to the Muslims, the religion, all that kind of thing. And so they might get their act together too.
I know Dr. Kerr has to leave for another appointment, so we have to be really short. I know you have the last word if you wish. I have another obligation, if I may.
You're going to leave me here with this crowd? I'm not staying.
No. We do have a group of interns who are completing their
One more question.
summer assignment, and I wanted to recognize them. For 1 second, where are you? So could you come closer here, very quickly? So everybody will see who you are. Remember, you're on camera now. Smile. Okay, very quickly, your name, school, and your major.
I'm Bill Bodie. I go to Wake Forest University, and I'm a political science major.
I'm Brian Yost. I go to Northwestern University, and I'm majoring in political science and economics.
I'm Logan Glissa. I'm a rising senior at Catholic University, and I'm studying politics.
I'm Anna Elizabeth Halbert. I just graduated from the University of Mary Washington, and I graduated with a major in international affairs.
I'm Kathleen Tiley. I go to Colgate University. I'm a rising senior, and I major in peace and conflict studies.
I'm Sharon Leani. I just graduated from the University of Michigan. I majored in political science and biopsychology, cognition, and neuroscience.
I'm Ryan Pettit. I just graduated from George Washington University with a degree in political science.
Hi, I'm Philip Schwartz, and I'm a rising 2L at Seattle University School of Law.
Hi, my name is Heather Pickerel. I'm a rising junior at Harvard College.
I'm Chris Brown. I'm a rising senior at Duke University.
Thank you very much. So that's the next generation. I'm afraid that they will do a little bit better than the previous generation. Anyway, General, you have the last word.
Well, obviously you all have to leave. So, well, thank you all for coming here, and we hope you will return for the next seminar. I'm sure. What's the next one, Yoni? You know?
Well, we're still planning.
He's not talking. Still in the planning mode. But despite all the gloom and doom today, there is hope for our great country. We're still the greatest crowd on the earth, and we're gonna work through this. We'll be all right. And I think if you take a look at what the world's going to look like in 2035 or 2040, we're going to be right up there with some of the others. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
General, we will have to get him a copy because this is